Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Nick Levitch, and I'm here with my fellow host, Jimmy Nguyen. Thanks for joining us today. This week, we are talking all about ego death, ego dissolution, and what this concept or term actually means. And especially as psychedelics have become more mainstream, a lot of us hear about this term ego death, ego dissolution, yet have very little framework or context for actually conceptualizing or understanding what this is, what it means, what it feels like. And so that's really what we're going to focus on in this episode today, knowing that we've got a mix of listeners who are both, experienced journeyers as well as those who have never had a journey. We'll do our best to describe what this process is, and how to prepare for it, what the significance is, and just generally help you wrap your mind around what this buzzword means.
Yeah, I like how you said that, wrapping your mind around the concept of ego dissolution. And, I also recognize that this is a very deep topic that touches upon a lot of different genres, philosophy, shamanism, psychology, neuroscience, the mechanisms behind all of that stuff. And I have a little bit of a hot take, and I have a lot of respect for Jungian philosophers. I have a lot of respect for, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, Ram Dass, who really popularized this term, I think, back in the 60s. However, I say very vehemently that the way that our society views ego death can be quite harmful to folks, and to me is kind of bullshit to a degree. I'm not saying that ego death isn't a very important process of the self-discovery and healing for many folks, but I very much view like ego death as some type of like objective or goal for some folks. And I don't think that there's enough conversation around supporting the process of ego dissolution or ego death in a safe and supportive way, so that you can come out on the other side with the best opportunity to heal and grow from it. And so here's where it rubs up against me when I chat with when the guy on LinkedIn hits me up, and he's the CEO of some pharma tech company who's doing psilocybin, and he's like, nope, I don't have ego. I killed that thing a long time ago. Yep, one big ayahuasca experience, that thing's dead. I'm good now. I'm like super blissed out. Everything's amazing. Or folks who say, man, I really want to experience an ego death because I feel like that's the only way for me to evolve beyond myself and some of these things. And so I think it's a little bit for me about the expectations and the phrasing around ego death and ego dissolution and all that. So maybe let's just start with somewhat of what we understand as a definition of ego death. Do you want to take a shot at it?
I think we need to start by defining ego. So
sure.
For people who don't have a familiar concept of what's ego versus what's not, the easiest way to think about this is the ego. We're multidimensional beings. We have all these different aspects of ourselves. The ego is the part of ourselves, or the aspect that is rooted in self-preservation, a sense of self, a sense of identity. And what is constantly striving for is surety, comfort, predictability, knowing, planning. And so you can see how those tasks, those mechanisms that the ego helps us with, are absolutely essential for day-to-day life. The idea being, if you didn't have an ego, you wouldn't go to the bathroom, you couldn't put pants on, you wouldn't eat. Like, your ego is
executive
quite literally
functioning. It would be very difficult if you were completely devoid of your ego.
So your ego keeps you alive. right? It's the part of you when you're in the jungle where you hear a branch snap and your mind goes, oh, is that a predator? And so the ego has a very, very practical role in our evolution as humans and as a culture. However, what can and often does happen in a psychedelic experience is that part of ourselves, that mechanism, gets turned down or off entirely. And so when people talk about the default mode network, that's oftentimes what they're talking about is your default kind of autopilot way of doing things. And when that gets turned off or down, it can feel like our sense of self, our way of being in the world is taken offline.
Yeah, or the way that you're processing and taking in and filtering information and stimuli from your environment, which the default mode network helps to do as well. We're bombarded with all of this information. What information is the most helpful for our survival? What information is the most helpful for us to, operate in this world as you're sharing? And as a part of that, the ego helps for individuals, like you said, self-identity. So that is useful when we view ourselves as this entity or being that exists in this greater environment, having the separation that I am me, and then this tree over here is this tree, and Nick, you over there are Nick, and there's separateness. That's useful in a
3D world.
in an organism trying to survive and eat and procreate and all of that. But then there's another layer to it, and this is where it falls a little bit more into psychology or psychoanalysis, where it also defines what you think about yourself. It also defines your view of yourself, your traits, your skills,
your role in the world,
your morals, your values. It's like it's a part on, if people talk about perspective and worldview, well, one of the ways for you to even have a perspective and worldview is to see it through your lens, see it through this, self-identity. And so it's then challenging when, that can become really attractive for folks, right? Folks who say, man, I just feel so limited. I feel that I just want to view things in a different way. I'm looking for that ego death. I'm looking for that ego dissolution. I really respect that with a lot of folks, but it's a different practice when you're actually going through it, and then how to navigate that, and then how to come out of that while not inflating your ego afterwards, while not superficially inflating your self-worth afterwards, and in a way that can view that in a sacred process as a part of your own healing, or as a process in your healing. But I will share with folks, you do not need to, an ego death is not a requirement in a psychedelic experience for any type of personal, spiritual growth, self-discovery, like any of that. So that's one of the things why I get so passionate about this topic, is that it creates a really high bar. Like, if I don't have an ego death, then do I get to heal through psychedelics? Or other people were like, well, if I don't meet God and don't get to chat with him, then maybe I don't. And that's a really, really high expectation, for folks.
Well, and here's the other problem. Some people aren't ready for full-blown ego dissolution. That's where we start to get into psychotic breaks, spiritual emergencies. Like, there's a reason that the mushroom takes you to where it takes you, is because it's only going to take you as far as you're ready for. We can only do so much healing at a time before our ability to function and remain stable in the world gets totally wiped out. And so this whole thing happens in incremental shifts. And so it may take you 3, 4, 5, 6 experiences before you have a true ego dissolution, and that's okay.
You may not even have one. You
ever
truly may not even have one. And I also want to add that, well, I think one of the beneficial things about the conversation of ego death or ego dissolution is this philosophy of a death and rebirth process. And many folks report that in a psychic capacity. Some folks report that in somewhat of a spiritual capacity. Some folks just report that even in a personal growth capacity. They're like, I feel like this old part of me is just dying, and then now there's this other part that's coming up. Well, the ego death can feel like a real death, or about as close as our mind can comprehend and expand, into that. And so that can be really jarring and scary when you feel like you're dying. You've heard about these psychedelic substances. They've been illegal and outlawed for like quite a bit of time. And then your defense mechanisms start to kick in the effort of your survival. And so I appreciate that this conversation does bring up those themes and concepts of like death and rebirth, which that's also on a gradient. Like for some folks, that can be a very small shift and change. Like, oh, I can let this to rest. Or there's this part of me that's really coming forward and getting reborn, all the way to actually feeling like you're going through a spiritual death and rebirth process, of which there's a whole range in between there as well.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear to anyone that's listening, ego death or ego dissolution in a psychedelic experience is a very real thing, and it can be very helpful. That's not the issue that we're bringing up. The issue that we're bringing up is that just because you've experienced an ego death does not mean that you have officially killed your ego, nor is that even the point. The goal here is to integrate the ego into your sense of being so that it serves you as opposed to you being a slave to it.
Yeah.
And so when people talk about like, well, if I could just kill my ego, I'd be a happier person. I'm like, you actually wouldn't function if we took your ego offline permanently.
Yeah, and it's not a competition either. It's not like, oh, I've had 6 ego deaths. Like how many have you had? Like that actually has just no barometer to somebody's personal growth, healing, anything with psychedelics.
Right. And so the like it typically does in this world, it always goes back to integration. Having an ego death it can be a beautiful experience. It can also be scary and frightening, but it's got to be integrated. Regardless of how it shows up, it's got to be integrated. And the question is like, okay, well, now that you've experienced that, what do you do with it? And this is where the real work comes in. It's anyone can go through the experience. It's what we do with it that makes the difference.
Yeah, that's so right. I mean, I'll share something for myself, is that in a medicine ceremony, I really fell deep into this ego dissolution, where it was really hard for me to figure out where the boundaries of myself were in relation to like the floor and the whatever. Really hard for me to determine like what was mine and what wasn't mine. That was the way that I was describing it. And it felt like my skeleton was trying to jump out through my soul. Like it was so uncomfortable and all of these things. And one takeaway that I had was that one of the ways that I was trying to grip and hang on to was through my thoughts. I was trying to hang on to my thoughts and trying to use my thoughts as some anchor. And it led me to this whole thing where I was like, my thinking mind is one of the ways that I like attach to this reality. And that then opened up a whole exploration and a whole thing. But to your point, it requires support and to integrate that and to whatnot, because if you have an ego dissolution and you do nothing after that, well, your mind is going to compensate for it and just going to tell you some stories so that you can make sense of it and move on, whether that was all imaginary, it's not real. Maybe I had some bunk, substance, and it was just some side effect. Don't worry about that. Let's get back to the regularly scheduled programming. And so it's really, really important for those experiences to be acknowledged and processed through. Really, really important.
Yeah. So now that we've kind of explained what an ego death is for those who maybe haven't experienced it or don't conceptually understand it, I mean, what do we do with this information or with this experience? Like, what is the benefit here?
Well, I like to first and foremost talk to folks who are newer to psychedelics, folks who are newer to exploring their consciousness, with or without, a substance or a medicine. I much more use the term like sidestepping the ego or ego dissolution, because as a part of ego death, there is baked in there is this sense of return. That's the difference between an actual death and an ego death, among many things, but that we get to come back, And so when I use a phrase more like a sidestep or a circumvent the ego, it just naturally talks about this idea of, coming back. And so what I like to share with folks is this analogy of a car. If you yourself are, if all of your identity was in a car, and the ego is the one that's been in the driver's seat the whole time. It's like got its butt grooves in there. It's been sitting there. It's got its favorite radio stations on. It's all that. The ego has been driving the whole time. And again, to your point, this is your sense of self, your sense of identity, your sense of beliefs, your sense of decision making, all the things that you define as this rigid you. Well, the way that I describe in a sidestepping of an ego or ego dissolution is that part of you who's been used to being in the driver's seat the whole time. Maybe it is in the passenger seat, or maybe it is in the back seat. And maybe that part of you just gets to look out the window without worrying about the GPS and the navigation and where to go and where to all that. And that can be useful because if we're using this analogy of going on a trip, or if we're using this analogy of just like moving in some trajectory in our lives, that means that other parts of ourselves get to go into the driver's seat. And so that can be really helpful to what you're talking about how do we take this part of us that's usually the dominant part of us, and then how do we integrate it with the other parts of ourselves? And so that then is useful in navigating the psychedelic experience, but then it's also really useful in integration, because what we'll find, and what many people find, is that ego is going to want to get right back into that driver's seat again, because that's where it's used to being. That's where
It
been
thrives
at.
there.
That's its zone, and it's been there for likely decades for folks. I mean, across many different ages, but it's home. And so what I also talk about for a lot of folks is this boomerang effect. For many people who do have an ego dissolving experience, with psychedelics or through an altered state, chanting, meditation, deep spiritual practice, what have you, sometimes the ego comes back with a vengeance. Sometimes it really comes back and tries to grip on the control of your life. And when we talk about control, those are the mechanisms. Just defeating the ego and killing the ego, controlling the ego. These are all constructs of
the ego itself, basically.
Exactly. And so it's counterintuitive for many folks who want to kill the ego. Well, what I share with folks instead is, how about it's about understanding and coming into relationship with your ego. Because if you're planning on going to war with your ego, if you're trying to control the ego, which is a mechanism of control in itself, well, then you're kind of fighting fire with fire to a degree. And so I like to just reframe the whole concept for folks about how they approach any exploration of the self and any exploration of, their ego. And I think it starts with coming into a more collaborative intention with all of these things that you explore about yourself. You're not like at odds and at war with these things. Many people may feel like that, by the way, but I really share that one of the best ways. What do we do with this? Well, it's about, if in sidestepping your ego, then maybe you can interact with it differently. Maybe you can come into a different perspective with it, and then maybe that does lead to different thought processes and habit patterns and changes and beliefs about yourself, right? But all that has to work in somewhat of a harmonious way. It's not about just being a combatant to yourself and to the ego as well.
I mean, if this whole path is a journey of self-love, loving all parts of ourselves, then making an enemy out of the ego is at odds with that. And so,
yeah, well said.
What's really important is, how can we embrace and integrate all parts of ourselves, including that, pesky little ego, or maybe it becomes our friend and our ally through this process. And so one of the things that I want to touch on is, I mean, we've given a lot of kind of words of warning around kind of, how not to look at an ego dissolution experience. But I want to touch on why these experiences can be so therapeutic and healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps where I'd like to start is by identifying that this is an opportunity to consciously die before you die. And people talk about these near death experiences and how they change their lives. Well, what if you could have one of those but your physical body was actually totally safe? It's like the people that get in a near death car crash, they see their whole life flash before their eyes, and then they re-enter their body and go, oh my god, I have to change the way I'm living.
Mm.
This same phenomenon can happen in a psychedelic journey through an ego loss and ego death.
Mhm.
um, The other thing that it's incredibly helpful for is allowing us to view our life in a more objective fashion without our defense mechanisms and our social conditioning clouding the way that we see ourselves and the way that we interact with the world. Those two things, even of themselves, can be incredibly healing and profound. Once again, assuming we then integrate them, but you can see how even though it is can be scary and uncomfortable, there's a lot of utility in that, provided that you are prepared for it.
Yeah, and what I hear is that when folks talk about ego death, they're really only focused on the first part, which is the separation and the dissolution. Where what I'm hearing that's very important for you is the return. How do we
Right.
then bring it back, and then how do we integrate and all that? And there's a lot of philosophy around this. It's why the hero's journey, the work by Joseph Campbell, is really just enticing, or a good model for exploring, the psychedelic, processes where, to your point about getting opportunities to die before you die, is that you get to come back. And that when you come back, okay, then what do you do with that? How does that change the way you define yourself and the way you show up in this world? And so, even in that like hero's journey philosophy, it's about that separation, then the transition, but then incorporation, about coming back into this space, because otherwise it's just a
What good
death.
is it? Yeah.
Yeah, you just get to have this experience, and then it has no reverberation on the way that you live your life now. So it's in that return I'm hearing, and that should be baked more into, I think, the modern mainstream media conversation about ego death, is what do we do upon the return.
Yeah. And the other thing that is, for me personally, important to highlight is our birth into this world is not by choice, and it's not conscious in nature. It just kind of happens. And same thing with our actual physical departure, our death. It just kind of happens. This is an opportunity to experience both the death and the rebirth consciously, intentionally. Like you're actively choosing to engage in this process, or at least hold the possibility that it may happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that changes the whole way that we relate to it.
Yeah, I mean, it helps you to define your beliefs around your own ego death or ego dissolution process, if you have one. Meaning, is this process something that's just traumatic and jarring and difficult, and then that's it? Or is this a process that is all of those things, but also inherently in there, there's this opportunity. There's this opportunity to grow from it. There's this opportunity to evolve from it. And um,
This
don't
is
get,
this
yeah.
this is the same thing that helps with death anxiety with terminally ill patients and
Mm-hmm,
cancer patients,
mm-hmm,
right? Is you have an opportunity to experience that death before a death, if you will.
yeah. Yeah, and I'll share with folks that I don't know if I've ever met anybody. Maybe I just need to meet more people who have shared that an ego death experience was like easy, easeful, and comfortable, and like piece of cake. These are challenging and overwhelming and difficult parts of the psychedelic experience, which we have chatted about, quite a bit, in the past, about how those experiences, just on the other end of them, with the right support, with the right integration, can be very, very meaningful to our own healing and the way that we live our lives. So how about this? So you have, let's say, a client who comes and works for you. They're kind of aware that ego death is kind of this thing, whatnot, and then they're engaged in a ceremony, and they thought that maybe they were just gonna explore some things. They thought maybe they were gonna, have some insights and whatnot, and then they're plunged into an ego dissolution or ego death experience. What are some things that you would tell, that you would share with the client who would maybe who might walk into that possibility? And then what are some ways of navigating that maybe actually during the experience?
I mean, first and foremost, I think there's always got to be an acknowledgement in preparation that that's a possibility. So much of the trauma associated with it, or potential trauma associated with an ego death, can be alleviated by just expecting that it could happen or
Caught
understanding.
off guard by it or knowing it's a possibility.
Correct. Being caught off guard by it is brutal. If you at least know it's a possibility, you're like, okay, this is normal. And the most important thing is that it's temporary. And so, what allows us to hold this is knowing that it's temporary and that you will return back into your body. It may only be a few minutes that feel like hours or days where you're kind of like in this place of nothing and everything simultaneously. But you will return in your body with all your neuroses, with all your baggage, with all your stuff. It'll
For
still
better,
be
for
there.
worse,
It'll
for
still
better,
be
for
there.
worse, you'll return.
It'll be there waiting for you when you get back. Um, and so a lot of times just a couple of those key reminders can be so helpful because um, it's really uncomfortable when we're trying to assert our sense of self and we can't find it. I mean, that's basically what this feels like. Imagine being in a like floating through space and you're looking for yourself, like, where's Nick, where's Jimmy, and you can't find it.
And you're not even looking through your own eyes and your own body at that point. You're just like, I know that there's something here that is having this thought and having this thinking, and like there's no reference point or
Nothing.
orientation point to the rest of you.
And
Yeah.
so this is actually important because you've touched on this before, but what are the things that people can hang on to when they are having that experience? Because there's very little you can actually hang on to for some sort of grounding, stability, comfort, all the things that the ego wants, which is why we're really big on returning to three different things: either the breath, a mantra, or your intentions. You
Mhm.
can always come back to those, but beyond that, you're just grasping at straws, and there's really no stability or certainty when you're floating around in that timeless, ineffable space.
Which is why you need someone around you. I mean, look, I've been through a lot of solo experiences and a lot of things, but it wasn't because I thought I was some badass doing that. It's because I just didn't have that support. Like it's hard to find people to like be there for you in that real, true, deep, state of service. But to have somebody to, if you might even be able to make a vocalization while you're going through this, or just expressing something that's difficult and stuff, and then just having somebody just reassure you that you are safe, that you are sound, and that you will return, and maybe
Yep.
just repeating that to you for a couple of hours if you need to, which has happened,
I
with
had an
clients. Yeah.
I had an ego death personally when I was journeying, where I was with my partner, and um she had her head on my lap while I'm in the middle of this ego dissolution where I have no idea where I am, who I am, how I got there, don't even know that I took medicine. And um, just the presence of another person is tethering, like it's helpful. And so, and we hear this a lot reflected back to us as facilitators from the clients that we work with, is even though I had no idea what was going on, I still knew you were there. Like there was this
Hmm.
intuitive knowing. I could feel your presence.
Yeah, and that's with or without like physical touch, just sometimes
Correct.
being there and having somebody breathe in the same air as you in the room and sharing the same, space for both of your nervous systems to do what they do is really helpful. And then also that might not be a person. I know like holding an object or something like that can sometimes be helpful for me, but that can be hard when you no longer have hands. And so
Yep.
I've reached out in, some circles, and somebody held my hand and I was like, oh, there is there is a reference point for me to just traverse through this
I'll
experience.
share a funny story as we get to the end of this episode here, which is that I sat with a client who long time depressed, major depressive disorder, treatment resistant, just kind of like has always lived with this. And we did a journey, and he had this experience of floating around in the nothingness, full blown ego dissolution. And when he returned into his body, his sentiment was like, wow, I thought my life was such dog shit. But after being in whatever space that is, I was praying to come back to my life that I previously thought was so shitty.
Yeah.
And the reframe that this experience has, it doesn't always, but it can make us so grateful for our human bodies and our quirks and our dog and our family and the experience of eating food. And for anyone that's been so deeply disconnected and dissatisfied with their life, this is a major opportunity to reframe what it means to have a human body and what a gift it is to be able to experience, this human existence.
Yeah, which goes back to your question earlier on how this can be potentially so therapeutic to folks. By the way, I'll also say that it's not a requirement to do, like, there are other ways for the psychedelic
Totally.
to be, therapeutic for you, but all of the things that you're saying are in that return,
Yep.
are in that return. And so there is this potential for that perspective shift for you to get outside of the lens on how you normally view your existence and normally view the world, of which an ego dissolution experience is a prime example of that. It can be really, really powerful when you do return to your body and you have gratitude and you're like, oh, like I'm here and I still have all my shit and I still have all my problems and I still have all the things I want to fix, but boy, am I so grateful that I'm back. And it is in that return that you're saying very so eloquently. That's really where the juice is, I think.
Yep. Yeah, you're consciously being reborn, and another way to say it is like you're consciously re-entering your body after being, unplugged or out in the ethers. You can think of it however you want. It really doesn't matter what language you attach to it, but that experience of being somewhere else,
Yeah,
and then coming back into your body.
And I'll very resoundingly share with folks, and maybe we can end here, is that the difference between an ego death or ego dissolution or sidestepping the ego, however you want to say it now, the difference between that being an extremely traumatic and psychologically harmful experience and the difference between that being a catalyst for healing is how much support you have around you.
Yep.
Hands down, that is the only difference. That is the only difference, is how much support you have around you to help for you to process and be seen. Because look, even if you go through that and you have all of your own tools to integrate that and you have all of your own things, if you never shared that with somebody out loud, then your mind can at some point convince you that it was all an illusion and that it was all fake. And so just being witnessed and seen in that process, supported in a really meaningful way, I think that's the fundamental difference between that being super traumatic and that being the emphasis or the catalyst for healing.
The last thing that I want to say is that, and this is perhaps a bit more spiritual than some folks are comfortable with, but it's worth noting that if we're having this experience of being dead and yet we're still experiencing something, the question is, who are we? And what is that role of awareness in the way that we experience life? And the way that this shows up in integration oftentimes is there's this inserting of a little bit of space between the thoughts, the emotions, the bodily sensations, and then the part of us that just simply observes and watches the whole thing. And you talk about this term, the witness, a lot, but I find that a lot of people don't even know what that is until they're forced to take that step back.
Until that's the only way that they can navigate their psychedelic experience, is just be in their witness. And I always just ask this question. I'm like, who is the one? That's what I always say that to myself in turn. Who's the one that's feeling these emotions?
Yeah.
Who's the one that has this viewpoint? Who's the one that defines it? And then who is the one? Well, who's the one that got to there? And who's the one? Where did that start? And who is the one? So I just keep like, it's like a Russian nesting doll thing. I keep like backing out and backing out to being like, well, who is the one? I don't have an answer for it, by the way. But it is in that, in getting out of these constructs sometimes and returning, where we can have any opportunity of turning that into something meaningful in our lives and the way that we live our lives.
Yep. Beautifully said. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of the Psychedelic Passage podcast. You can look for all of our episodes by going to cannabisradio.com or subscribing to the show on Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you love the show, please rate and review us. It helps others find us. It makes a big difference. And we'll see you guys next week.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.